I'm Ellie Shore, and this is Art, Women, and Culture. And we invite professional artists to come and share their work with us. And we particularly focus on women who have been addressing themes that have to do with women's lives. Tonight we have Vicki Siegel, who is a painter and whose work deals with memories of personal nature and our whole collective experience, and has to do with identity and gender and sexual discovery and the environment, which is real important. And she's got work at the Highland Library right now in a two-person show. And so, Vicki Siegel.
So I'm Vicki Siegel. I'm a visual artist. My studio is in Delray Beach, Florida, and I have a BFA from University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and I'm going to show you a little bit of work that I did in grad school, but I do not have an MFA. I did grad work a long time ago. My work deals with memory, and I'm a mixed media artist. This is called Narrative Through Memory. I'm a narrative artist whose works are informed by memory, both personal and communal. Ellie asked me to talk a little bit about things that influenced me. So I was influenced by Mark Rothko. I've always been interested in transcendence. It's just part of my being, the spiritual nature, and it shows up later on in my work. I've always been interested in anything that was weird and strange and otherness. And so as a young artist, Diane Arbus's works were a big influence on my work. And you'll see that also coming up. Mary Ellen Marks and her social documentary style of photography was a big influence on my work. The spatial relationships of Hiroji are a big influence on my work. This is an artist that I don't know if many of you are familiar with. Her name is Beatriz Milhazes, and she's a Brazilian artist. And what influenced me from her work is her method of working, which I'll explain to you a little bit. But as often I find with people who I say influence it, I actually work that way and then all of a sudden discover that there might be somebody who's very well known, as she is. She's in museums all over the world, who actually work in a similar way. Her physical way of dealing with paint is very similar to a way that I've developed, which I'll talk about later on. I was a photographer. I started off working, always wanted to work in advertising. That was what I wanted to do. I'm a child of the 60s. I felt that the medium was a message and I could influence the world. Young person that I was very, hippie kind of kid. And really wanted to influence the world through mass media. So that was my studies, that was my focus. But then I fell in love with photography. So in Champaign-Urbana, just as I was showing you, I was always interested in anything weird, the strangeness, the otherness, and I found that I was always able to focus on that through the lens of the camera. So these are my photos. These are photos back from like 75-ish, I would say, 76. I used to photograph in South Beach when South Beach really was South Beach, before South Beach became a mecca of famous people and beautiful hotels. It was a place where many old people spent their winters, actually. And I spent a lot of time there photographing people down there. So then I went to grad school, and believe it or not, I went to grad school at Tyler, which is a fairly well-known art program in Rome. I applied directly to Rome. And they gave me a graduate school advisor who, in 1978, did not believe that photography was an art form. It's so hard for us now to even discuss that because we've come so far from that discussion, as photography is basically what most museums show now. Anyway, this is work that I did, 79. Again, always interested in the strange, the otherness. Then I became very interested in multiple images, and I started printing multiple images on the same page. And I would say that a lot of my work is very idiosyncratic. the form that I see between the rocks and the boys is a composition that I see a lot of similarities in. See similarities in the way that they turn their heads and the focus. So these are the type of odd groupings that my multiple images would take on. Then I left grad school. I didn't get my MFA, and I went into advertising. And I was lucky enough to be able to use my photographic skills and my art direction skills, and I did very large multi-image pieces. I worked in Chicago, then I worked for Medicus Intercon in Milan. So I was in Milan working for them for 5 years, and I did multi-image is a huge, before video. So we'd hook up 30 slide projectors with a computer, and I'd have a soundtrack created. And these multiple images would flash on and off together, and it would create almost like a film. And there's a few of them that are very famous. You know, there's the Boston Experience. And I worked on Italy, Country Made by Man, which traveled all over the world. Come forward in time. As a painter, I started using multiple images in my work. I was very involved in the idea of bridges and some natural, the environment and interesting palettes. And I was experimenting with various paint techniques. I'd paint in oils, I'd paint in acrylics, and I started using something called image transfer, which is where you take a photographic image and use a paint medium and then get rid of the paper, and you have basically the toner or ink from it embedded into the paint itself. So again, this is kind of like older work where I'm just experimenting with technique, imagery. You'll see the birds are always images that I come back to. In this, I'm developing a technique of time, you know, where I'm scraping through the layers of paint. I'm sanding through the layers of paint and using various images. This happens to be an image that is a satellite photo of exactly where the bridge is, this particular bridge. And I always find myself kind of like saying I'm somewhere in the painting. And in this case, I happen to think of myself as being the bird looking back on it. And this happens to be one of the bridges, which, as I mature as an artist, comes back. So again, this piece is called Peace and Love. And in this piece, I start really delving more into the idea of memory and the bridges. So I started on these bridge symbols, which you can see here. The symbols, this piece has a lot of Fibonacci influences in it. You'll see there's, you know, the shell, the Fibonacci numbers. And I started thinking a lot about not just the bridges that unite, the bridges that separate us, the bridges that we cross or we fail to cross, but also other things in our life that come up. So all of these things are embedded deep into this painting, and it's painted over and it's scratched back and it's sanded and it's scraped, and there's just a lot going on within it. At the same time, I was combining images, and if you look at my website, I have a section called Image Combines. So I was calling these things image combines, where on the one canvas I would put up multiple, like, kind of boxed out imagery. And you know, little did I know until after I started doing this and I put it on my website that, oh, by the way, Rauschenberg is famous for image combines. You know, everybody knows those are what he's called. But I actually became aware of that name for those works of his after, you know, I had already been doing this work for a while. So again, you can see this is Can You Hear Me? And I'm combining the idea of personal imagery and collective imagery and maybe very abstract imagery all into one canvas. So here's where we get down to kind of the crux of tonight's discussion, which is narrative and memory. I think that memory is a source of inspiration. It's a source of our lives. It's something that forms who we are in many ways, as individuals, as people, and also as a society, a culture. The culture is actually, you know, the narrative and the memory. The memories form a form of storytelling for me. I use the memory as self-discovery, and I use the memory to create a recognizable narrative. So in a lot of my work, I won't tell people what I think they should see, or maybe what I was thinking about when I'm deep into these paintings. Because most of this is so incredibly personal, but yet I hope that you find within the work something that is more universal. So in this piece, which I call Moon Shadows, there are 4 birds. Each bird is like really individual, and it's got layers and layers of paint on it. And those layers, from a technical point of view, are scraped and scratched and layered on. And within it, there's image transfers. I do paint occasionally in oil, but I love the nature of acrylic paint. It does some things that no other medium can do. So besides being able to make an image transfer, I can make a sculpture from it, which I brought something like little sculptural later. I'll show you that as well. But it just has a certain nature to that that enables me to experiment a lot, that I think that a lot of other mediums don't allow you to. So that's why I actually focus now exclusively on acrylic and use acrylic mediums in my work. So this piece is called Bridge to the Past 1. And this piece is, from a technical point of view, it's painted in acrylic. What I was interested in, believe it or not, was the harlequin pattern on the girl's coat is what triggered it out. And if you could actually see this piece in real life, which you have that opportunity if you go to Highland Beach Library and see the show, it is heavily textured. And throughout the texture, there are various textures using this kind of diamond harlequin pattern. So to me, this generalized painting is a story of power. It's the power of this little girl who, on her seesaw, manages to keep the little boy up in the air permanently. He never gets to come down ever. And I use these architectural elements to kind of give it an actual time and space. So it brings a nostalgia. I use a limited palette, also adding to that idea of nostalgia. And I like to combine, so within this, there's a zillion paint techniques. There's image transfer, which is actually just a small little piece of this area of the coat, and the rest is layers and layers of paint. And there's a lot of drawing going on through here. This is all drawn. There's some graphite all up there in the actual painting. So this tells a story, as I said, of power, and maybe, to me, there's also like a little kind of weirdness and sexuality there with this young girl with this, thing stuck between her legs and kind of like something that's kind of vague. I won't go there too much, but I do think about that because you're working on a painting for a long time. You're thinking about a lot about what you're doing. And you're thinking about that for quite a while you're working on a piece. So this piece is called Bridge to the Past 2. Here we come to that little boy in the narrative, and technically speaking, it's very heavily textured. All through here, there's just like layers and layers of bright paint. The image transfer is actually just like this little portion of the area of the space. And this is really the story for me about a young person whose life was actually cut short. You can see that through the bridge that's cut in half there. Again, I use this very nostalgic technique of keeping a limited palette. And people sometimes breeze through these paintings and think kids at play. And they're not about that at all. They're actually very sad stories, because the true narrative is that the 2 kids in these 2 paintings are me and my younger brother. He died at a fairly young, 40-ish age. And it took me probably 11 years before I could actually come to it. And to me, I start telling these stories. So the general stories that maybe I wasn't telling you this tonight would be that you might just see a story of a child, but you might look a little deeper and say, okay, well, he's suspended in air. He's suspended. Broken bridge, something's broken in his life, and that's what this story is about. There's more to it. You can look deep. There's the hat. There's all sorts of little symbolism. This story is about a young boy and sexual identity. again, there's a piece of image transfer, which I brought out into the entire painting, and the rest of the painting is painted in acrylic and then used oil stick for drawing. So again, I'm combining images, I'm combining technique, oil stick and drawing along with painting. These are all like things that are part of my artistic work. And this is also a little bit of image transfer. So, you know, I think that pretty much everybody kind of sees it's sort of a little bit sad. I think it was a child that's unfulfilled. So for memory, all of these come from a very particular flashpoint memory for me. So that means that they are a personal memory that's a specific night. Again, this is my little brother. And obviously he was gay. He happened to have died of AIDS at the age of 40-ish. And which I was kind of telling you that, you know, it took me a long time to be able to really paint about him and talk about him. And I have two older brothers as well. We came from a, don't need to really wash my laundry too much, but very dysfunctional family. And so it's, you know, there's a lot of stuff. And I was, for a while, washing all my personal laundry and my paintings. So this is called Bridge to the Soul. And it's really kind of like my ode to him. I always felt that if he could have been more comfortable with himself and his sexuality, he probably would have been a happier person. And who knows, maybe even, you know, here today to share life with us. But okay, so from very personal memories, I started working a little bit more with the idea of collective memories. Again, the bridges that unite us. This is Bridge Over Troubled Waters. And, you know, within it, we have some things that to me were important images growing up, as well as, you know, my woohoo kind of weird ideas on spirituality. So there's the eclipse. I had a year where there were just like a lot of deaths in my family, and it all was that summer where we had that eclipse. So I blamed everything on the eclipse, and then of course it showed up in my painting. And again, we have the birds. The birds are often in my work as symbols. And there's the man, you know, first step on the moon. There's just a bunch of little things. There's children walking off in the distance, you know, somebody kind of looking back. A rose that came from a hat in a photo from my mother. And those are all image transfers. And it kind of all works in this very nostalgic, limited palette. This story also is a painting that stems from a memory and also tells a story. So here I start developing more a narrative. So the narrative is about these two women and the fact that they moved a lot. They moved all over the United States, and you can kind of see the outline within the painting of the states. Do you see that? Up, kind of there, yeah. And then all this is done with image transfer, and I like the image transfer. I use it not only for its photographic effect, but the fact that I will show you, I paint behind it, I paint on top of it. Depending on, I manipulate the images. They're not just like taking a photo and using it and sticking it on it. I'm not collaging. It's a whole different process where I'm working, and already by the time I start picking something, this picture that, like, I got the shoes from was probably, it's my great aunts, who I had 5 great aunts. So they were my grandmother's sisters. They came from Canada. They traveled the entire United States together. They were always moving, and all of them got separated. So this was a little bit of that story about the 2 great aunts that are there. This is called Reach for the Sky, still part of my bridge series, and I had decided that I really was washing my personal laundry in the, you know, out in front of everybody in my paintings for a while, and I just said, okay, now we got to, you know, get happy. And it also happened to be a time in my life where it was a big change. I am now an empty nester, and I was like, woohoo, sorry, happy to be that, and, you know, to not have all those other responsibilities anymore. So for me, one of the happiest times was being on a swing as a kid and reaching for the sky. And in this piece, I asked somebody to model, as I often will. We went out, I had her wear specific clothes. I already knew when I went to paint this what I wanted. And so all the pieces of it kind of fall together, but they fall together kind of slowly because we had to do a photo shoot, and then I had to manipulate that on the computer in the, you know, getting the colors that I wanted that outfit to be. Usually I take away all the color, then I add in the color, and it's a whole process. And the image transfer on this is just like a little piece, part of her head, one arm, part of her skirt that you can see the bright color, part of her leg, and the rest is all painted. Within this I have imagery, some of it actually from kids, but it's, you know, all about home, and there's scratched into the paint, there's the sun, there's flowers, it's just a lot of things. And this is, you know, again, part of that bridge imagery still within the work. So this tells that kind of happy story. This is called Gioia, which in Italian means joy. And as I mentioned before, I lived in Milan for 5 years. I worked in Milan. It's kind of a place that I consider a second home in Italy. And I had a lot of great experiences there, including giving birth to a son. And this happens to be, which I then was required to take back every summer. So I did lots of trips to Italy. And this piece, I started experimenting a little bit with contemporary uses of paint. As I said, I love acrylic paint. I love all the different things you can do with it. And in this case, I created this drip background that unified this nostalgic moment of being with the birds. The image transfer is a little part of his face and this part of his pants. And it's hard to say why I become like entranced with one weird section, you know, why the shoes, why the stripes on the pants, but it's just the quirkiness of being an artist that, and then if you see the actual painting, you can see the background right through it in this. Sometimes I paint behind the image transfers and you can't see. It all depends on what I'm going for. So in this case, I did want you to be able to see that background through it. And then this is all painted. This part is pure paint, but this is actually photographic. So you have this play of realities within the work. So I become more and more interested in collective memory and society, and I think that that's, you know, anybody who's dealing with memory and narrative art that tells a story, be that story personal or not. So I just put down a few thoughts about memory and society. So collective remembering is a way or a part of creating a culture and identity. Remembering works to identify a collective past and derives from a framework of shared cultural understanding. So all of this storytelling, as we all know, storytelling is part of our culture. They say that the first women artists were the artists in the caves. Those cave art supposedly are done by women. And that remembering sustains myth and ideology about people, cultures, and is more than an individual mental process. One of my jobs as an artist, living the artist's life, would like to sell lots of artwork and just be able to live that way, but that doesn't always happen, so I also teach. So one of the places that I teach is in a religious school. I'm Jewish, and I teach Judaic art to K through 10. And over the years that I've done that, those stories that I create, like traditional art projects for them, like let's say I do a watercolor, oil, pastel, and watercolor relief, I might turn that into like Noah's Ark or some other thing. So by working with those stories, that kind of seeps into your being, and those collective stories, to me, form a part of our memory. So I became a little bit obsessed for about 1.5 years, which tends to be when I become obsessed with something, it's usually about 1.5 years that I stay on it. Jacob's Ladder. I can't tell you how many Jacob's Ladders paintings I have and sculptures. You can see if you look carefully, there's like kind of an abstractive Jacob's Ladder's head and the ladders and spirituality. And this painting, interestingly enough, is a method of spontaneous abstraction that then all of a sudden I saw those things in it and then just brought them out. So this is about Jacob's Ladder. You see the angel. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? Everybody sees that. Okay. This is called Ascension. As I said, transcendence always really interests me, and I have this symbol, as you can see, that little squiggly thing towards the top, that comes out in a lot of my paintings, kind of representing the spirit rising. So this is a large painting, sort of, well, large for me anyway. It's 36 by 48, which is about as large as I usually go, 48 inches. So this piece tells the story of Joseph from the Bible and his multicolored coat, but it's his story. So I'm going to stay on this for a second because I think it's kind of an interesting piece. First of all, the background is this background isn't just plain white, it's all textured, it's got a lot of like subtle things going on within it. And then within this was created, as I said, I play with the idea of acrylic paint a lot. This piece was not painted directly on it. This piece, if you look at this piece, everything in it was painted chromatically on sheets that I created different textures in different colors so that I would be able to then cut those into various shapes that I wanted chromatically and be able to put them back onto the outline of the robe. The robe itself, up at the top, there's like a little brushwork because I couldn't work on a robe without thinking about Jim Dine's work. So anybody else who's thinking about that, I knew it. I knew that, it's just like too many of them not to think about it. So within this painting of chromatically, you'll see up at the top, there's, a face of Rachel. There's Joseph as a little boy. Right here through the green, which I'm sorry that you really can't see that well, are 9 jealous brothers. He was a dreamer, which is why this is called the Dreamer. And there he dreamt that the stars, the 11 stars, came out, and the sun and the moon. He felt that he was foreseeing his future as being a leader. He also dreamt about the wheat, and behind the images of, as we all know, he ended up in Egypt. If you believe in this story, I mean, it's a collective story. It's one of our collective memories. So if you believe in this particular story, he ended up in Egypt, and behind Egypt there's wheat that represents some of his. And then, besides that, there's like a ton of other stuff going in. If you see this for real, each one of these are little hearts. There's like every one of this is textured. It's so textured and developed, and each piece is different because I didn't paint it on. And you can't get that type of texturing in that way because you'll never be able to get like the type of stripes within the paint that I get unless you do it in the way that I do it. So anyway, it's kind of a unique piece. So then, just to make it a little bit more odd and to bring out the dreamer in this piece, I took an essay by Dostoevsky called White Nights, and in the center, I've repeated that story over and over and over again, but I pulled out words and I've created my own poem within the painting. Just something else visually, crows. For Carla, crows are in it, the word, half the soul, the dreamer, dreams, seeking, a flame, rekindled heart. I mean, it's kind of like poetic. So I pulled out my own poetry from within that work. And at the very bottom of it, it says, Dostoevsky on the painting, so in case anybody's really academic. And then here you can actually see what I was talking about, how this is very textured. You really would be hard-pressed to be able to get that type of like a texture like that. And you can see how it's cut out. It's actually pieces of paint that are actually then applied. So surprise, surprise, still on, as I said, I get very involved, still on Jacob's Ladder, playing around with, that idea of ascension and transcendence. And I get that from when I was a kid going to the Art Institute, which is why Ellie mentioned that as a teenager I would go down there for drawing classes. But before, I would go sit in front of their abstract expressionists. I mean, I was lucky enough that they had these gigantic canvases, big Pollocks, giant Rothkos, Morris Louis, and I was just able to really sit there and just absorb those, and I had a passion for that. And I felt that through the painting, through the art, that there was always something bigger than me. That's how I look at it, and what still excites me about art in general, why I like to look at others' art, why I go on. This piece clearly is a Jacob's Ladder piece, and I just, sometimes get an idea. I do occasionally make sculptures. I work in clay, I'll work in wood. I have some recycled art. I have one of those down at the library right now, a recycled art piece where I combine recycled art, things that I found with the paint skin and light, and it's a sculpture. So anyway, this piece is actually called Jacob's Ladder. And the idea of it was from, the rocks, all of the imagery within it. It's made out of wood, painted in acrylic. All of the gold that you see, which could look kind of decorative, but is actually also painted apart. I created it with acrylic paint on separate sheets and applied it to there, the same way you would gold leaf, think of that. But it isn't gold leaf, it's actually just acrylic paint. And there's ink drawings throughout it that kind of represent the idea of spirit crawling all over this piece. And the rock, that kind of represents a spirit, and that kind of flies right off, and there's a tiny little painting of the sky. So this is one of my sculptures. The better lit it is, the more interesting I think the piece is. The lighting here, I wasn't able really to move around. So we're getting to now more recent work. In my stories and in my narratives, I've always had this piece in particular. I've always had an interest in the environment. Last week we were all lucky, or 2 weeks ago, lucky enough to have Eco Art here. I mean, it's so big and so important that to come back and look at a painting, it's almost embarrassing, that, okay, this is my statement about the ecology, and I have other paintings too where I, point, they're all about the ecology. This piece is called To Have and to Hold. The idea of it is kind of a Venus figure that comes out of some sort of cosmic miasma, whatever that is, the water, the cosmos, whatever. But if you see the painting, she's clearly holding, you can see it's North and South America in her hands. And the idea is that we have this world in our hands. What are we going to do with it? Because in my opinion, we're making a big old mess of it, and we really, and the role of an artist is always to keep people thinking about what's important in life, what's important, what story are we going to tell. So this is a story that's very important to me. And you can also see this at the Highland Beach Library. And then more recently, I started on a new series, and this is the only piece of the new series that I have here to show you. I also have a sketch that I can show you after. As I said, I usually stay about 1.5 years. I just got started on this. I already have a list long. I'll tend to do tiny little sketches and then make myself a list of my ideas as they come up, so that I can then work through and execute, because the idea might come in a flash, but the execution might take 30 or 40 hours of painting to execute. It just depends. So in this case, this woman, the ideas of women and what are we carrying with us. Traditionally, women have always carried a lot of the workload on their heads physically. We carried water, we've carried weights, we've carried food, we carry sticks. There's just a lot of things that traditionally people all over the world, women in particular, have carried on their heads. I was in Israel this past April, and I became a bit obsessed over the women with their head wraps. And then I started thinking about women all over the world who wrap their heads, because there's a tradition of women wrapping their heads. And so from that, I've just started this new series. And this too has, okay, so I go and I usually paint in my backgrounds, and then I started working on the face, the portrait. And my idea on this is I created the head wrap separately using the acrylic skins again. Painted them separately apart on a different sheet. Yes, I could have taken a palette knife and I could have applied that, but it wouldn't really be the same. It just wouldn't. And the idea of this was that I was going to layer in images, image transfers, of course, and I did have them in there, and then I felt it really, it's a very powerful painting. It's very large. The scale, because it's not, those are really large. This is, again, 36 by 48, but the scale of it is large for just a portrait. And I felt that it was distracting from this image. So I took them out, and I was glad. As an artist, sometimes you have to delete, even if it doesn't go with your idea. But I'll have lots of opportunity in the future to do more where I can include the various ideas of what women carry with us. This is my last slide, and what I just wanted to go over, as my ideas were, that I work with memory. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's collective memory. Those are all things that are very important to me. And I feel that continuing our narration, the narration of telling stories within a painting, is an important thing. It's something that will continue in the future. It gives people food for thought. It's a forum for discussing social issues. So, with this next series of painting, I hope to bring up more social issues, maybe rather than personal memories and collective stories. That's it.